One thing I think we need to get into in further detail, and we've touched on this organically throughout the conversation, is the letters and numbers that are part of the strain. So it's not enough just to say Alrhoderi, Crispatus. If people want to do this right, we need to make sure we're getting the right strain. And obviously in a podcast, it would be hard to go through all the different microbes, all the different strains, but just explain the importance of that so people can be aware when they're buying these.
Yeah, it's a real tangle, Jesse. And it's almost impossible to manage unless you have somebody who understands the science. So, for instance, if you want to use Lactobacillus rhodori as part of the effort to reduce your SIBO, so you want a strain that's been shown to colonize the small intestine and produce bacteriocins. So I, for instance, will DNA sequence our microbes to show that it has the genes for both those characteristics. Problem: there are strains of Lactobacillus rhodori. The most popular strain of rhodori is called and I'm sorry about that, I'm sorry about these, I don't make this up, NCIMB 30242. That strain does not produce bacteriocins, so it's useless for this purpose. So it's rhodori, same species, but it does not, it's useless for helping you eradicate SIBO. So I can tell you, if I say get this strain, I've looked at it. I've looked at either other people's evidence or we ran our own evidence, DNA sequenced it to show it has the characteristics we want. So, for instance, the Bacillus subtilis I like, we DNA sequenced it, and it produces 7 bacteriocins and a surfactant, like dishwashing liquid. Because part of success in eradicating those invading fecal microbes is microbes are smart. We don't think of them as smart, but they're very adapted, and they create a so-called biofilm so that they can hide. And that's why, for instance, if you had a fungal infection of your prosthetic joint, antifungal drugs are worthless. It won't get rid of it because those fungi are very good at creating a biofilm to hide in and makes them impervious to antifungal drugs. That's why they have to take the prosthesis out, which is terrible. But so the Bacillus subtilis that I like, I know produces 7 bacteriocins because I mapped its genes and a surfactant, and colonizes in this case, it's a spore, so it doesn't colonize, it germinates in the ileum. So you essentially have to trust the people who deal with microbes, who study these things, either know the evidence or have performed the evidence. And unfortunately, it's impossible for, let's say, one of your listeners to say, well, this is a strain of subtilis. Is this helpful or not? You won't know unless you actually search the evidence. Another layer of uncertainty is a company will get a strain and then change the designation to hide what it is or to fool your competition. So maybe you got the 30242 strain of rhodori, but you relabeled, and this is true, you relabeled it UAL-RE16. No joke. That's true. That's a real story. So you try to find, it took me a year to figure out what UAL-RE16 was. I called the company, I searched the stuff. I can't, I find, that's what happened. I talked to the manufacturer. They finally set me straight. But I had to go all the way back to the manufacturer to find out what that microbe was. So bottom line, you really can't on your own. You can search the literature if the strain designation was not changed by a commercial source, or you rely on people who I hope to say, like me, who actually understand the science, know the science, or perform the science, who can say, oh, yeah, that Crispatus produces lactic acid and produces 2 bacteriocins and we DNA sequenced it and it has the characteristics we need.
We've gone over a short list here throughout our conversation, different microbes. Somebody new to this, say they're going to make the Alrhoderi yogurt, can they go to your website and get the brands or strains for the ones we've been talking about? Obviously, they're likely more popular, the ones we brought up today. Can they go there to find that information?
Yeah, I try to make it as crystal clear. So it's in the Super Gut book. It's also in this new Super Body book, where to source the microbes, how to ferment them. So as you point out, Jesse, different microbes ferment under somewhat different conditions. Thankfully, most lactobacillus species ferment human body temperature. And typically 24 to 36 hours. Subtilis is a bacillus species. So that one you can ferment at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's it, about 34 or so Celsius, something like that? And you can ferment for 24 hours or even a little less because it's a very rapid fermenter. So it depends. Bifidobacteria species, we haven't even touched on that. Bifidobacteria longum, Bifidobacteria bifidum, very good species. Bifidobacteria infantis, really cool species with a whole bunch of really cool functions, including support of a female's reproductive health and infant's health. So if a child lacks, for instance, Bifidobacteria infantis, it's much more likely to not develop neurologically normally, to be at greater risk for type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes later on, obesity as a teenager, as an adolescent, more prone to autoimmune diseases. So one of the things we want to make sure in a newborn is that this child has Bifidobacteria infantis, especially if it's going to breastfeed, because breast milk is rich in something called human milk oligosaccharides. And if the child lacks Bifidobacteria infantis, for a lot of the same reasons, exposure to antibiotics, mom or baby, it can't digest those human milk oligosaccharides. If the child has infantis and can thereby digest human milk oligosaccharides, it's much more likely to have improved neurological maturation, likely to have a higher IQ, less likely to have type 1 diabetes, autoimmune disease. It's, in other words, critical for the life of this child to have that microbe. What's shocking, Jesse, to me, so I happen to be thinking a lot about these things because I have a daughter-in-law who just delivered her third child. And this is a woman with great resources. She has access to all kinds of resources, docs, multiple specialists. No one tells her about all the things a woman can do to stack the odds in favor of successful, healthy pregnancy and delivery and early childhood. No one mentioned Bifidobacteria infantis. No one mentioned Lactobacillus crispatus. No one mentioned Lactobacillus rhodori. No one mentioned, outside of microbes, the huge effects of omega-3 fatty acids on stacking the odds in favor of full-term pregnancy and neurological maturation of the child. Omega-3 fatty acids are critical for that period. No one mentioned it. So there's a whole bunch of things here not being passed down because the microbiome science is relatively new, meaning in the last 10 years, and it's going to take 2 generations, sadly, for most of my colleagues to say, let's say to your wife, hey, we should assess your vaginal microbiome to see if you have infantis that you can pass on to your child, see if you have crispatus to ensure you have a full-term pregnancy. Almost no one's doing this. So it's going to take some years. So in the meantime, we educate your listeners and they tell their docs, I'm taking Lactobacillus crispatus and making yogurt out of it, and it's delicious. And I'm giving my baby Bifidobacteria infantis. By the way, you can make yogurt out of that also. So it means people having to take the reins themselves. People say this is too much. You get all these crazy species names, and now you have Jesse talk about strains. But you know what? It's worth it. We're not talking about little benefits. We're talking about huge life-changing benefits. But some education, some work is involved. You have to understand these things to some degree. It's not impossible, but it does take some work.
Early in the conversation, I mentioned the fact that for my yogurt, I'm in the process of switching from coagulans to Bacillus subtilis, HU58. How is that strain? And what strain do you personally use?
The HU58 is a fine strain. I got it from my friend, Dr. Kiran Krishnan. He's a microbiologist who started Microbiome Labs. He since has sold it and left, but he remains a friend of mine. He lives like really 20 miles from my house, so we meet for lunch now and then. And he has studied that subtilis, and he says this is so he's got good evidence. He did the science and showed this is a producer of bacteriocins, et cetera, all those things. Now, I say that because there's a strain of subtilis you can get by buying kombucha, and it's the DE111 strain. It's a wonderful strain that produces no bacteriocins. So if you choose a subtilis that you want to use for eradication of SIBO, you don't want to choose the DE111. You want to choose the HU58, and I have a strain that I've studied that we know is this huge bacteriocin producer that I'll be talking about in the future also.
Can you tell us the strain or not yet?
It's so early, Jess, we haven't even named it yet.
Make it easy on us with that name.
But we did exhaustive work to make sure, because I would, primarily because I want to do that clinical trial. And I want to say, okay, we chose a rhodori and a gasseri and a subtilis, and we proved that they have the genes for colonization or germination in the small intestine and produce bacteriocins. We don't want to start with a microbe like, let's say, DE111. It's otherwise fine microbe, but it would be useless for this purpose. So I thoroughly studied those 3 species, had to discard a few. Like, some of the species just don't meet our requirements. And so I screen them. So if I say this is the strain to use, it's because I have evidence to show it has the characteristics that you need for a specific application.
So as of now, you recommend the HU58, somebody listening?
Yeah, sadly, Microbiome Labs, they tell me, it got acquired by Novonesis. There's a lot of reorganization in the microbiome world, and I'm told they're going to phase it out. So I'm hoping to be able to provide a strain that will replace the HU58, because a lot of the subtlest strains were not studied for this. In other words, you can imagine if you have several hundred different strains within a species, not every strain has been studied. So a lot of times we have to start from scratch and we have to submit it for DNA testing to see if it's got those genes. And so it's a work in progress. Now, this is not that important when it comes to fermented foods. So if you want the microbes, say like Leuconostoc or Pediococcus and all the wonderful effects from those from sauerkraut or kimchi, well, now we're talking about thousands of strains within a species. And so with fermented foods, don't even worry about it. You can't know if you bought commercial sauerkraut, for instance, that was fermented. They won't tell you what the strain of Leuconostoc is. And the only way you'd know would be to submit it for testing, and no one's going to do that. So you just have to accept some uncertainties with your fermented foods. And so key to this with fermented foods is variety.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
When you lose weight by cutting calories, your basal metabolic rate drops by about 25%. And for all practical purposes, it's permanent. Study after study has shown if you cut calories...